I'll just reiterate some things that we're now recording, but as Kelly said, I'm Annamae. And,
and I'm Luke Whittle.
And today we're going to be sharing our presentation, which is called Making Creativity Accessible and Inclusive for Disabled People and Individuals with Mental Health Needs. That's our contact details if anybody's interested, but you can also find the details, as said, on the Creative Lives website for everything we're going to talk about today. So a quick overview of everything that we're going to cover. So I'll quickly go over the introduction again. Kelly's already given us a great introduction, but I'll go through a little bit about that. We'll talk a bit about the background to the projects, because we both had two different projects, and then I'll cover some of the research questions. We'll very briefly go over the methods that we used for this project, and we will touch on some of the key findings. Now, there were quite a few, and there were quite a lot of detail in that, so we're just going to give you the whistle-stop tour, but feel free to check out both those in both of the reports. And then finally, we'll conclude, and we'll very quickly go through some of the recommendations that came out of both of these reports. And yeah, as Kelly said, we thought we'd finish with some questions to the audience, just as, you know, everybody has different experience and knowledge in the room, and we'll have time for questions for us too. So a quick introduction here. As Kelly said, we're both PhD researchers. I myself am at Glasgow Caledonian University and Luke is at University of Dundee. And over the course of the summer, we completed two related but separate research projects, which took place during a 3-month internship with Creative Lives. And this was supported by the Scottish Graduate School of Arts and Humanities. And we can see there the two lovely reports that are in their final presentation, thanks to Gareth, which was lovely to see. So on the left, we have Creativity, Accessibility, Inclusion, which was Luke's project. And then on the left, we have Creativity and Mental Health, which was mine. Yeah.
So moving on to our research itself, we thought we'd maybe give you a bit of background as to the context of where we were, where the research was taking place. So we chose to do it within our the locations of our institutions. So mine was based at looking at groups in Dundee, and Annamae's was groups in Glasgow. In terms of looking at that issue of accessibility and inclusivity for people with disabilities and mental health, we kind of hope that these would be good case studies for maybe groups broader in Scotland, as well as maybe further afield as well. So thinking about that, in terms of in Scotland, approximately 1 in 4 people in Scotland do experience mental health problems annually. And 26% of the population are living with long-term physical or mental health problems. In terms of kind of the areas of Dundee and Glasgow, both have some of the most deprived areas in Scotland, and their resources for mental health and disability are both quite limited. However, on the plus side of the research, we were looking at this idea of creativity and culture, and both these cities are thriving hubs of this. So just some examples, Dundee and Glasgow are both designated UNESCO cities. So for Dundee, it's design, and Glasgow recently was designated for music. Approximately 79% of Dundee residents and 70% of Glasgow residents are participating in cultural activities. So I think there is a strong case here that the kind of high levels of creativity and culture that we kind of came to see was also very felt in the community level. There's a good argument that this can be used to kind of work towards these issues around health and well-being in these cities.
So for the research questions then, given what Luke said about all the various issues with resources for mental health and disability, but that also the creativity is clearly a strong part of both of these cities, we were interested to explore, particularly at grassroots level, how are community spaces being made accessible for disabled people and people with mental health needs, so that they can engage in creativity. So these are the 3 main research questions, and they were quite similar across both of our projects. We've put them together for you today. So the first one was, what are the benefits that disabled people and individuals with mental health difficulties experience when they attend creative community groups in their local areas? What are their accessibility needs within these creativity spaces? Are there any barriers that they face when accessing local creative activities? And finally, how are the local creative groups promoting accessibility and inclusion within their activities? And what are any challenges that they encounter when making their activities accessible for these groups?
So to actually go about researching these questions, this is kind of how we went about it. So In terms of first step was our background research. So maybe at the start we should have mentioned this is quite new research area for us both. So I'm in history and Annamae was in psychology. So we started off with a review of the secondary literature, looking at that topic of creativity and disability and mental health. And then we went about mapping the landscape of creative community groups, both in Glasgow and Dundee. And then once we had this kind of map of the level of creativity in the community groups in our cities, we recruited for our research. So this was recruiting groups that look to support disabled people and individuals with mental health needs and inviting them to participate. There was also looking at broader creative groups that just had an interest in improving their accessibility or inclusivity for as kind of wide a demographic as possible. Once we'd invited particular groups, it was then moving on to the data collection. So for both of us, we conducted semi-structured interviews. That was with both the group organisers and where possible, speaking to some of the group members as well, and where we could get involved in some of their activities and seeing how they actually went about kind of participating in their creativity. And so then once we had our interviews, moving on to the data analysis, our interviews were transcribed in vivo and coded to start bringing up the themes, and then conducting grounded thematic analysis before writing our reports.
So this is just to give you an overview of some of the groups that we spoke to, and as Luke said, we had a wonderful time. We took part in different activities. We got our hands involved in creative arts and crafts stuff, which was great with the various groups. In Glasgow, for myself, I spoke to a range of different groups which focus specifically on making creativity accessible for those with mental health needs. So we had ACVC Hub, which was an arts and crafts hub for veterans. We had Milk, a community creative space for refugee and migrant women. Project Ability, which is an open art studio for disabled people and individuals with mental health needs. And we had City Rights, which is a grassroots creative writing group for people in drug and alcohol recovery.
In Dundee, for myself, I again looked at a variety of groups. So Opportunity, which is an organisation that runs arts and crafts workshops and other creative workshops for people with additional support needs, learning disabilities, and mental health challenges as well. Dundee City Pipe Band, which was a really interesting inclusive Highland pipe band that was one of the first pipe bands to be organised by someone with autism, and so trying to get as many people involved in that as possible. Nine Wells Community Garden, it's a volunteer-led garden which is based in the grounds of Nine Wells Hospital in Dundee. So trying to invite people who are long-term patients or families of patients involved in the, as well as the local community as well. Scrap Antics, which was a community hub which promoted creativity with a real sense on affordability and sustainability as well. And then Art Angel, which was a arts-based group which supported people with mental health needs, with also a particular focus on people who were challenging with drug and alcohol addiction or recovering from these addictions.
Yeah, and as Luke said, I think it's important to point out that a lot of these groups started often from people with lived experience who saw a need in the community. There was a gap in services or in, their access to creative spaces or into mental health or, resources that they needed. So they came together themselves and decided to take up this challenge. So a lot of these groups were born out of that. So we're now going to talk very briefly through some of the benefits of creative participation that the people that we spoke to discussed. So the first one, which was one of the most commonly cited and important reasons that people felt they received benefits from attending creative groups, was that it gave them an outlet for emotional expression and an opportunity to process personal traumas that they had experienced. So it allowed them to work through these and often engage with memories which they felt were really difficult. They couldn't do this in other spaces, and particularly the tactile hands-on activities that required multiple senses. So things like pottery, arts and crafts, painting, anything that they could get their hands into, and they could be really immersed in these activities. This allowed them to work through these feelings in a safe space, often in a very non-judgmental space as well. And creativity also enabled self-expression, but it removed the pressure to talk. So this is often something which is quite difficult for individuals with learning disabilities or mental health needs. And often they're dealing with really complex feelings that they might not have words for. They might feel judged when they try to explain these things, but they were able to just put that straight out into a piece of art or even into just a doodle or a piece of pottery. And this was often said to be a particularly helpful first step for people who would otherwise be reluctant to seek mental health support. So for example, with the veterans, a lot of the men there talked about how they just wouldn't feel comfortable setting foot in a counselling office. It wasn't something that they felt they were able to do, but they would happily come along to a weekly creativity group and they would sit with other people with lived experience and they'd finally be able to start talking about that. And then that would open them up to other opportunities for discussing those things. So we have some quotes here to share with you from some of our participants, which kind of expresses what I'm saying here.
So from Danielle Dupuy, who was the founder and organizer of Opportunity, talking about that issue of the kind of anxiety that can come with talking or traditional means of conversation. So she mentioned that this is why she really wanted it to be art-based, as you can express yourselves without words. Sometimes it can be quite intimidating or overwhelming to talk all the time, and with art, you don't have to explain it, you can just go.
And similarly, we have here the founder of the Arts and Crafts Hub for Veterans, who talks about his reason for starting it. He said, there's all this stuff that's in your head that you can't get out, and it can be expressed through arts and crafts. My drawings were actually about my main traumas. You know, there's traumas in the back of your head that you'll never share, but arts and crafts can help to bring that out. So that was a really important reason why he had started that, and he felt that he saw those benefits in men who had similar experiences to him and women as well.
The second key benefit that we wanted to highlight was that theme of community building and reducing isolation. So particularly in Scotland, which we're focusing on, people with long-term health conditions and disability are twice as likely to experience severe loneliness. And following COVID-19 and the cost of living crisis, these aspects have become even worse. So in 2023, 15% of disabled people in the UK reported feeling lonely often or always, and this is compared to only 3.6% of non-disabled people. So something that creative groups, quite often when you speak to people who are involved in creative participation or meeting up with people for creative activities, these ideas of a sense of community and friendship are quite often buzzwords that came up a lot. So they're already very good at bringing people who lack social connections. But as we were just discussing in that previous slide, the ideas of talking to new people or kind of opening up, it can be quite anxiety inducing for people who have these complex conditions or complex feelings and emotions. So groups which are inclusive and open to people with disabilities and mental health challenges is a really good opportunity to kind of share lived experiences with other people who understand what you're going through. And so using this idea of creating communities, but as well as creating support networks, which allows for a much deeper sense of community with people who understand you. And again, that can kind of build confidence and, as we were saying before. So a good example with this came from Art Angel. So a member of that mentioned that I don't have many friends now, and friends don't understand why I cancel things at the last minute, or they won't go out, or I won't go out. People here understand this is my happy place. Art makes me happy, and I love doing it.
So a further really important benefit that lots of members talked about was that attending a creative group in their area gave them a chance to develop a positive sense of identity, and it also allowed them to challenge stigma associated with having mental health needs or disabilities. So a particularly strong part of this was that many participants had discussed that they had to leave employment, often due to physical or mental health difficulties that they encountered. And this could create a profound sense of loss and distress, especially if these social connections were lost as a result. So a lot of people talked about how they had gone through life and they'd had a relatively normal experience. They'd attended a workplace and they'd built up friends and connections and they'd taken on leadership roles and different responsibilities. So this really gave them a sense of purpose and a social life. And then when they because of their health difficulties, could no longer fulfill these roles or, take on the same hours or the same strains. This was all lost. They were left with absolutely nothing. And it's important to note that social inclusion in society is often linked to employment for many people. And there is a lingering perception that those outside the workforce are perceived as either less engaged with society or as not contributing to society. So they really felt the stigma associated with this. And so creative groups offered an important sense of routine or responsibility as they took on different roles. Maybe they were teaching others who were newer to the group how to paint or how to get involved in the activities, and they were acting as a role model. And this gave them an important sense of purpose that they had lost elsewhere. And as I said, that it allowed them to challenge the stigma around disability and mental health difficulties, because they suddenly found that they had new skills which had nothing to do with employment that they could then showcase, and they could take a sense of pride in. And this challenged societal expectations for these groups. So we have a really great quote here from Belle, who is a Reconnects member at Project Ability, the open art studio. And Belle is now an artist. She has gone through that process, which is fantastic. So she talked a little bit about that here when she said, "I was a proper workaholic, and when I got really sick, I couldn't do that, and I found there was a massive void. The act of making really helped me build a sense of identity. Identity is so wrapped up in work, and then losing that, I just didn't know who I was anymore, and my self-esteem was rubbish. So now art has filled that gap. There's a lot of stigma around unemployment, especially long-term unemployment. So being around other people who are also unemployed and on benefits shows that it's a real non-issue. It doesn't mean anything to anyone at all." And she talked about how when she was having conversations with people, they would introduce themselves by their jobs. So, people would say, "Oh, I'm a teacher, I'm a fireman, I'm this or I'm that." And she felt really excluded from that. But going to this place and being able to say, "Well, actually, I don't work, but I do take part in all these other things. I have all these skills. I mean this thing to these people when I go there, and I have things to talk about." That was a really important part of attending creative groups for her, and a huge benefit. So now we're going to talk about some of the barriers that participants discussed.
So yeah, I think where we've just mentioned there about all these really tangible and really important benefits that groups can provide people with additional support needs, we did in our conversations with groups experience that a lot of people had barriers accessing the groups, or the groups themselves had faced barriers in being able to provide these creative activities. So one of the first barriers that both of us found was the obvious accessibility of venues, and then a reoccurring challenge of transport issues. So disabled people and those with mental health needs, they often require familiar and reliable creative spaces, which can be designed for their specific needs. So quite obvious things such as accessible toilets, ramps and lifts, and then maybe things that people don't often think about, but ideas of quiet, open planned areas with breakout spaces, which can be used to reduce stress. Quite often, new spaces can, again, be quite anxiety inducing or stressful for people. So kind of adapting spaces to suit these needs can be very important in creating these safe spaces for confidence building, community building, safe spaces. However, often the adaptations that are required can exceed the budgets of grassroots groups. We also found that groups talked about a shortage of suitable and rentable venues that are available to them. Temporary venues, so where groups are maybe renting out community centres, but this can change week to week, can quite often be unsuitable. That limits the types of adaptations they can make to the spaces, so they're just reliant on what's available to them that week. And it can then be very difficult for them to communicate to their members what the levels of accessibility are if they don't know where they're going to be from week to week. On top of this, another issue was around transport and, for example, disability parking. We found that a lot of groups were mentioning the issues around public transport. So there was a lot of public services were being cut. People were talking about bus stations being removed, which again was making it difficult for people who maybe don't have their own car, or taxis are unaffordable, is making it much harder for them to get to their groups. Also, the cost of public transport in general was rising. There was also that issue of public transport being quite a stressful experience for people who have additional needs. So if you have autism, or if you're recovering from trauma, these kind of situations can be almost impossible for you to actually go about and do. So how people actually accessed these spaces was something that kept being talked about. So Rosie, who was one of the founders and organisers of Archangel, mentioned this when she was talking about they have a permanent space which works for them. So she mentioned that people will argue, do you really need a space? Could you not just do this by hiring a room when you need one? But you do need a permanent base because you need to be able to foster it as a safe space for people. So that idea that changing between spaces, you can't have that familiarity and that community building.
And similar here, so Daniel, who was a veteran who attended the Arts and Crafts Hub and was identified as recovering from PTSD, said, I'll never do public transport. And that's mainly down to the fact that it's unpredictable with other people. When you've got hypersensitivity and you're hypervigilant, the unpredictability of other people just creates this hypervigilance to kick in. And he said, I normally stand nearest the exits, so I assess as soon as I walk in. So public transport is tough. It's just a no-no for me. So again, he was talking about the fact that although he had access to public transport and he was on a reliable bus route or a train journey, for him, his mental health needs just meant that just wasn't possible for him. So I think it's really important to remember that, on the surface of things, people can have all the conditions that they need, but it's important to ask what are their specific accessibility needs, because it just might not be possible for them. So another important barrier that we talked about with participants and also creative group organisers was the issue of insecure funding. Now, this is also an issue for all creative groups, but it had specific implications for people who were disabled or had mental health needs. Oops, go back. So grassroots groups, as Luke said, often lack necessary funding to make accessibility adaptations, and this also prevented people from accessing disability and mental health training for staff and volunteers, which would help with relations between group organisers and group members. There was a reliance on short-term grants, which, as Luke said, limited consistency, so they weren't able to provide those consistent spaces or consistent activities or fund the same people to come in and deliver the groups. And also even accessing and seeking funding was stressful because writing funding applications to keep groups afloat was time consuming, and it often diverted resources from actually running the groups. There was also a really strong competition for funding, particularly among grassroots groups in smaller local areas. And the focus on quantifiable metrics within these applications, so needing numbers and percentages and being able to really showcase with numbers your impact, often made it difficult to convey the life-changing impact that these groups actually did have on vulnerable members in society. And so groups often felt that their important contributions to local communities, and particularly the most vulnerable people in society, were often undervalued by funders and local councils. So we have here Gabby, the founder of Milk, which is the community refugee space, which said, I think that for a space to be relaxing and for people to feel comfortable in it, you have to put some thought into that. But that costs time, money, and resources that people don't have. As services get cut and as people have got less and less money and more to do, these sorts of organisations are going to really struggle to hit the note because you need time. This project has taken years to build up with the help of so many people, and it's really hard to build a space like this. And she was emphasising that it's really important to get these things right so that you have these spaces be accessible for groups that really need them and that they're able to keep coming back. Because if the space isn't right, that just creates additional stress for people with mental health needs and disabilities.
And the third barrier that we really wanted to highlight was that idea of accessible communication. So we briefly mentioned it before. For people who are entering a space or wanting to attend an activity, but without the knowledge of what their levels of accessibility are, it can often deter them from participating or even going. By putting the onus on to participants to ask the group's questions about their accessibility needs, can often make them feel like they're a burden, or can perhaps make them kind of feel guilty for asking. People might not just might not ask because it's quite an anxious thing to do. You're having to put yourself out there to find these things. So for groups to openly and honestly communicate their accessibility is very helpful. It makes people feel welcome in the space. It reduces that anxiety and those feelings of kind of being a burden or that feeling of guilt. And then it also normalizes conversations around accessibility. So if people are already aware that this group is advertising their accessibility or they're discussing it, they'll feel more welcome to ask for additional questions or for additional information if it's already being discussed. However, how that communication is actually done, so is really important as well. A lot of people who perhaps are more who have disabilities or mental health challenges or come from more deprived backgrounds, their access to technology or their digital literacy there's a higher chance for it to be quite limited. So again, excluding disabled people and individuals with mental health needs to actually access this information and be able to participate. A lot of the groups that we spoke to mentioned that as well as maybe using digital formats, they also try to use paper formats, so things like posters and leaflets, and try and direct their communication to those groups that they're wanting to target. So the founder of Scrap Antics talked about this. They focus in a particular community in Dundee. So she mentioned that we don't put everything on social media. We target people where they are, because otherwise a lot of people who are just well versed at social media and technology will be the ones that are coming to the free events, and maybe they're not the community that you're targeting. Maybe people don't have that access, or they don't have those skills to read posters and things. So you really need to make sure that you're connecting with people in the right ways and in the right places.
And similarly, we have Elizabeth, who was the artistic director at Project Ability, the Open Art Studio, who said that people just assume that everyone in the world has a basic level of understanding of technology, and it really is not the case. People with learning disabilities can really struggle to communicate electronically. And she mentions that they were booking for the summer term and they put that booking form online as well as sending out the traditional paper copy that they usually did. And only one person out of 36 was able to complete the electronic booking form by the date. And these were people that really wanted to take part in the activity. It wasn't like a reticence to sign up again. They simply weren't able to access those online booking forms and go through the process of putting in an application. She says as more and more is moving online in that direction, it's going to leave a lot of people behind. So a further barrier that was really important that lots of people mentioned was the need to learn to play again. So participants, particularly those with disabilities and mental health needs, talked about struggling to engage in creative activities due to a fear of failure. And so while this is a thing for everybody who's a beginner and something new, and it can be stressful for all people to take on new skills with that fear of failure, people with mental health needs particularly found the vulnerability of making mistakes was very challenging. And this was amplified for them, especially if they had experience of trauma, if they had low self-esteem, and particularly people from marginalised backgrounds who had experienced poverty or, insecurity of resources. So they talked about the fact that it was crucial for group organisers to understand this issue, and it could be mistaken for disinterest or refusing to participate in an activity, particularly if you had somebody that was coming in that was maybe a little bit shy or a little bit anxious, who just simply was a bit reticent to take part in activities, who wasn't throwing themselves into things the way that other people might. But they wanted to emphasise that this didn't mean they weren't interested or that they didn't want to take part. It's just that the social and emotional risks to them of doing that and not being able to do it well just really played in their minds. So here again, Gabby, the founder of Milk, says, I think there's a real fear for a lot of people, particularly if they've grown up in real poverty where they've had to work when they were young or they haven't really played as much. And I think they can be a bit reticent and feel, I don't know how to do this. It's a privilege of having a childhood where you're allowed to do whatever you wanted. If you've not had that, then it can be quite a difficult thing to get your head around. The privilege of being allowed to play is something that I don't think many people think about. Just picking up an instrument or a football or whatever and not having to worry too much about whether you can do it or not. People's value on time is different depending on what your economic circumstances are. And she talked about how a lot of the women who came from refugee or migrant backgrounds really struggled with this. Like, for example, they were doing cake making, and she said that, if something went wrong and the cakes tasted awful or they were burnt, she would automatically like, right, let's start again, that's fine. And some of the women really struggled with this. They were like, oh no, we have to save it, we have to try and do something with it, because they were coming from circumstances where they maybe didn't have the right income to, to waste resources. And so that felt really stressful for them, the idea of throwing things away. And similarly, people who had never tried something before, they were worried about, criticism from other people in the group, especially if they were new to the group. This was just a really risky process. So it was something that group organisers have to take into account when somebody's sitting there and they're maybe not jumping in and taking part the way you'd expect.
I'm sorry, I'm hard of hearing. Could you possibly speak a bit slower, please?
Oh, sorry.
Um,
Go back there.
no worries.
There we go.
So I think finally, what we want to look at though is, although there were these really important benefits, and groups were facing these challenges, groups themselves were obviously very resilient and were still managing to provide these benefits. Otherwise, we wouldn't really have been able to speak to them. So taking from their experiences of how they still kind of manage to offer accessible spaces or how they might like to improve these accessible spaces, we came up with a few recommendations or just approaches that they use. So although these were 2 reports, and there's probably a lot more, we've kind of condensed them to what we thought was important for what we've talked about in this presentation. So first of all, that idea of accessible communication that we talked about, groups mentioned about making sure that they promoted their activities in an accessible format, and making them kind of widely available to suit their audiences, and just being open and honest about the levels of accessibility. Considering the space, obviously individuals will need different levels of accessibility, and people will interact differently with different spaces. So groups mentioned about considering the space and incorporating the idea of accessibility, not just into the space, but also into the group's thinking and their thought processes, and being open to frequently reviewing these processes in your spaces. Part of that though is that being accessible isn't going to be possible 100% of the time. You're not going to be able to predict the accessibility needs of everybody. So being flexible and adaptable to suit the needs of people is really important, and just being open-minded that you might be faced with a situation which you weren't expecting, and having those conversations with people. And I think that idea of conversation then brings us into this idea of representation and lived experience. So being able to consider people's lived experiences of disability and mental health was really important when you're structuring accessibility. A lot of the groups talked about how actually speaking to people and getting to know them on a personal level, as well as incorporating them into a community, it makes providing accessibility much easier because you know what people need and what they want and how they feel. And then tying into that was the idea of having representation of these lived experiences at an organizational level. So we mentioned Dundee City Pipe Band was founded by someone with autism. The actual board for that group had a majority of people with additional support needs. So people who are coming to groups, they feel much more comfortable if they know that their experiences are being felt at the kind of organizational level, and they feel much more welcome. So that's something that can be really important to try and incorporate into a group structure. And then one of the important things we came across was groups taking part in collaborations and networking with other groups, other charities and local services in their community. Something that was really important was that groups were able to share their experiences. They were able to share knowledge of accessibility. A lot of bigger groups who are maybe focused on additional support needs can be a really good source of knowledge for smaller grassroots groups that are just starting and they want to improve their levels of accessibility. Sharing spaces was really important as well. If you're a group that's maybe not got access to a space, a lot of these larger groups might have permanent spaces and are willing to share them, and they're already being set up for accessible requirements. And then being able to share activities between groups was something that a few groups were doing as well. If they perhaps didn't take part in an arts group, but they knew a group that did, and they had members that wanted to participate in that, this was a really good way to kind of increase the level of creative opportunities for people with additional support needs and mental health challenges. And then finally, that idea of freedom to play, as Annamae was mentioning just at the end there, making sure that spaces are welcome and open, that people feel that they can take part in their own way. So at Art Angel, they were talking about they weren't, it wasn't art therapy, it wasn't them teaching them how to do art, it was giving them the opportunity to express themselves in any way they felt, and they can make mistakes, they can start again, and being able to provide that culture of peer support so people feel comfortable was really important. But like I said, that was just a whistle-stop tour of the approaches that groups take, and a lot more of them can be found in the reports as well.
So just to conclude, creative groups clearly provide many significant benefits for disabled individuals and those with mental health needs. They often offer essential pathways for community reintegration. As I said, when people have stopped taking part in the workforce due to their needs, or for various reasons they are feeling isolated as a result of their mental health needs or disabilities, so that they provide opportunities to get involved with their local communities and have a stake in that. And therefore they serve as valuable, often overlooked resources for promoting health and well-being. As we've mentioned today, there are clearly numerous barriers which limit the accessibility of creative spaces for these populations. However, many grassroots creative groups are already doing an awful lot to enhance their accessibility within these spaces, and often with very limited funding. And there are lots of groups which have more funding, which are doing different things, but even at that very, very small grassroots level, just the decision-making processes and the way that people are involving people with lived experience in those decisions can make a really big difference. And also the importance of asking about people's accessibility needs can take things a really long way into making people feel comfortable within those spaces. And so we can often learn from their valuable insights, and we hope to share some of those through the reports. So finally, we'd just like to stop for questions, but we